Right, good evening everyone. Can you just put your hands up if you can hear me for those who've got their cameras on, so I know that, okay, great, I'm being broadcast. Okay, yes, just to say good evening. Before we get started, I just want to issue the usual legal disclaimer that I have no credit to take for this at all. This is the immense hard work of Melanie and Catherine, who are with us this evening. They've been instrumental in getting the ELA online and into this virtual space. And it seems, in my humble opinion, to have been a great success for the association. And I think tonight's just another feather in both of their caps. So thank you to them. And I'm really looking forward to this evening in terms of the expertise that we have on the panel. Obviously, the documentary that I'm assuming that you've all tuned into and had a chance to have a look at. Before we go any further, there is just a special welcome to, and forgive me if my pronunciation is not the greatest, Tawane Kupe, who's the VC at the University of Pretoria. It's an honor for us to have you with us, and thank you for joining us. I trust you'll enjoy your stay with us this evening. So my role this evening is just to pull the levers, as I'd said to the speakers earlier. I don't want to bore you with what I have to say. When I look at the CVs of the people that we've got to give input on this evening. But just as we start, this is obviously the third in a series of streaming sessions that the ELA have had. And this one deals specifically with energy justice and energy security, which I think at the moment are particularly topical, but also, I mean, have been topical for some time. But the torchlight of focus, I think, has been placed on these issues here in South Africa, certainly, by the island of Cape Town, more particularly, but also internationally. The energy space seems to be in a huge amount of transition. But let me not bore you any further with my anecdotes. I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, and that's Tanaka, who's very kindly said she'll take the reins to begin with. Tanaka Shumba is, I'm going to try and do her justice, works for a crowd called SEA, who are based in the Western Cape. That's the Sustainable Energy Africa. And she is a chemical engineer by trade, but is using those skills in the renewable energy space, looking at particularly alleviating poverty and trying to work with communities, particularly in the Western Cape, around what I can only imagine must be an enormous task to take these communities entirely off grid. So I'm really excited to hear Tanaka's views, obviously tying in her experience with the documentary that we've just seen, which is was taking an entire island off the fossil fuel grid, as it were. But Tanaka, let me not bore everyone else any longer and just give the floor over to you to give us your insight and inputs. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. And thank you very much, ELA, for inviting me to this event. It's very interesting to be surrounded by so many lawyers, but yeah, let's see how well this goes. So as Patrick mentioned, I am from Sustainable Energy Africa, and we are an NPO, non-profit organization based in Cape Town. And we predominantly work with local government in South Africa, as well as in the greater sub-Saharan African region. And we work in different areas. So our main core focuses are around renewable energy, energy efficiency, climate change, as well as energy access. So as I mentioned, we work predominantly with cities. So our role with the cities is actually trying to help support them to encounter or engage with this energy transition that we're currently in. So we provide them different forms of support. So this is through capacity building with the municipal officials. It's also research and development, and together with the SALGA, South African Local Government Association, and SACN, which is South African Cities Network, we run an urban energy network which is it's like a network meeting where different cities in South Africa come together to discuss topical energy issues. So this happens like at least 3 or 4 times each year. So as you can imagine, when I was watching this documentary, the main thing that was in my mind was looking at this from a city perspective as somebody who predominantly works with cities, and just trying to understand how the issues that were highlighted in the documentary can be interlinked to what we are currently facing in South Africa. So there were, I think, 4 main points that, jumped out at me pretty much. The first one was the issue of having a champion. The second was having political will. The third was around finances, and the fourth was around community buy-in. So I'm just going to address those 4 issues and try to put that within the scope of South African cities. So the first thing being having a champion. So as we all know in the documentary, there was the guy who pretty much ran with the program with the idea of having wind coupled with hydroelectricity on the island. And what we have found from our work with South African cities is that usually there is a champion. There is a champion that is driving the agenda. I know if we follow the news a lot, there's always a lot of negative press around what's happening in municipalities and cities, that probably they're not providing enough energy, or they don't care about people, or they don't care about climate change. But in actual fact, they usually are the people within those municipalities that are trying to drive those agendas. And in bigger cities, we find that they have not only just one champion, but they have entire units or departments that are dedicated towards driving that agenda. So for example, in city of Cape Town has a whole unit, city of eThekwini has another unit, city of Tshwane has a whole unit that's dedicated towards sustainability. And through these different units, they're trying to ensure that the whole municipality is aware of the issues that are faced by the city. So in terms of sustainability and environmental, climate action and all that. But the biggest challenge that many of these champions seem to be facing is around political will. So political will comes in the, in the form of national government having agendas that are not entirely aligned with what's happening at a local level. So a city might have its own mandate to push, but if the city is waiting for national government to put together those agendas and to drive that communication, then no change actually ends up happening. So as we saw in the documentary, our champion was a politician, and he was linked to the president of the island as well. So, you know, having that political will to help push his agenda really helped move forward the project that he has. And I'm sure if we've been following the issues around the court case, City of Cape Town, the issues with DMRE, we will understand the different challenges that cities are currently facing. And then looking at the issue around finance. So I think, okay, personally, I do not have enough expertise to talk about finance in terms of renewable energy, especially from a large scale. But what I do know is that from a small scale, implementation of small scale solar systems or PV systems have been a big hindrance towards their dissemination in different cities. So we all know that renewable energy, as much as we would all want to put solar panels on our roof, it's still very much inaccessible to a lot of people, to a lot of organizations as well. But what we have found, like from the research that we are currently doing with cities, is that small scale embedded generation, so basically putting solar panels on a commercial building, is financially feasible for commercial customers. So that's been through the different research that we have done. And as a result, we've had lots of commercial sector owners or commercial sector building owners putting up PV on their roof or solar on their roof. And that has, you know, brought in a lot of questions around whether or not cities would still be able to sustain their revenue if, you know, people install small-scale embedded generation or PV on their roof. But what we have also found is that within cities themselves are saying, okay, yes, there is a high possibility that we will lose out revenue if people, generate their own electricity. But they're also now putting in, tariffs to try and facilitate this process, and they're trying to put in, the correct tariffs that will enable them to, remain as a sustainable business. So then linking onto that finance, we talk about the energy transition. We talk about having a just energy transition. And we can't have a just energy transition if we continue to forget about the low-income community that we have in South Africa. It's not enough for us to talk about having solar on a rich person in Constantia's house. We also need to think about the people who are living in informal settlements. But unfortunately, because of the current costs that are associated with renewable energy, as well as the business models that are currently being implemented, a lot of poor people or low-income communities are currently pushed out of this just energy transition. So they themselves cannot experience the joy, or they can't have renewable energy installed, or have it within their communities or on their houses themselves. So I think, in short, what I can say is that South Africa, obviously we're very different from that island, but I think there are strides that people within South Africa are trying to make in order to push this transition forward. And cities, I think, are at the forefront, at the heart of trying to push that energy transition. I think that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Tanaka. That's, I think, set the scene particularly well for the rest of the discussion. I know, having listened to that, there are all sorts of ideas and issues in my head that have come up. But at those 4 issues, I think, really do bring it together. The issue of having a champion, the necessary political will, the finance, and then obviously the community buy-in. It's a suite of issues, which when you say them like that sound quite simple, but the nuances around those particular issues are obviously immense and very much case specific, I can imagine. Okay, just in respect of timing, sorry, there were a few things I'd forgotten. We're going to jump from speaker to speaker, and then hopefully at the end we can have a more open floor discussion. So if you think of a question or anything like that, please pop it into the chat so that you don't forget the question and we don't forget to address it. And then at the end, we'll hopefully be able to have all the speakers interacting on the different questions. So if you've got a specific question for a specific speaker, please just pop that in. And then we'll try and address everything within the timeframes that we've got. So thank you again, Tanaka, for your time this evening. We are very, very grateful to have had your input. Reshmi, you are now on the firing line. So if we can ask you to come on board, I'm going to just try and give Reshmi some justice as well. I seem to have maybe mixed up Reshmi and Tanaka in respect of the intros around special.
I can introduce myself if that's easier.
Hold on, Reshmi. Let me try. So Reshmi's involved with Green Cape, which is also based in the Western Cape. We seem to have a Western Cape bias at the moment, which us from KZN don't always like, but we'll have to deal with. You guys are at the coalface, it would seem. But Reshmi's expertise in Green Cape, which is also an NPO down in Cape Town, extend to as far as putting Wi-Fi enabled streetlights in communities, which I didn't even know such things existed. So I'm very excited to hear about the work that's going on down there. Reshmi, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and thanks to the whole ELA for having me here. I must just disclaim that I may have to clear my throat regularly. I'm getting COVID tested tomorrow, and we'll see what happens there. But on that note, I'm Reshmi. I'm from Green Cape. We're an NPO down in Cape Town, but we have a national focus as well. We are a sector development agency, so our main mandate is to remove any barriers to growth and investment of the green economy. We started off only focusing on energy, but over the years, over the last 10 years, we've started expanding, looking into water, into waste and sustainable agriculture, as well as industrial symbiosis, and a couple of things in between, anything that really gets covered under green economy. And our placing is between academia, government and industry. So our main outputs are market intelligence reports that we developed through ongoing engagements with industry to try and understand what their barriers have been, what the opportunities are in that space, in the different spaces we work in, and also to understand what the changes have been in regulations and laws, and how we can help municipalities, similarly to SEA, try and adopt the tariffs that have been developed along the way. So yeah, so we kind of, being in that little middle spot grants us a lot of privileges. We have a year on in each of those different sectors, and we can use that to help businesses and to help governments to make decisions on anything really related to green economy. So I'm on the energy team. I'm a senior energy analyst. I was previously the energy services desk, so any projects that looked at energy efficiency or small-scale embedded generation came through my desk, and then I connected them to the people that could help if it wasn't me. But since the last 2 years or so, our focus has expanded into energy access, and the alternative service delivery unit was born, and that's my passion project, if you'd like, at the moment. So essentially what we do is we work with private landowners for the most part at the moment. Luckily, we haven't had to deal with municipal red tape yet. But we've worked with private landowners to try and assist communities on those properties to get access to interim energy while they wait for relocation, in the case of some of the communities we've worked in. And in case of those that won't be electrified by the grid, to help them with some form of energy to solve their problems while they wait for that. So we're active in 3 different communities at the moment. So the one that Patrick mentioned is out in Atlantis. Our whole process is run based off a very in-depth community mobilization and enumeration process. We co-design solutions with the community by understanding what their profiles are, how they're made up. We give that information back to the communities. They can do with it at that point what they will. So a lot of the time they might go to a municipality and protest they don't have enough toilets, for example. But if the municipality turns around and asks them how many people are in your community, or how many people are at home during the day, or basic questions like this, they might not have those answers, and that's not useful for a municipality to work with. So that information that we gather with them, we give to them, they can use it, and then after that, if they want us to proceed, we run a process of verifying that data with them. Sometimes it's embarrassing to admit that you use bush toilets versus flush toilets, or you don't know where this information is going. So you might say you don't earn money when you do because you're worried about social grants being affected, for example. So we use the information we've gathered, we verify it with the community members, and then we run a prioritization exercise with them to say, these are the problems, or this is the information we have, what are your main problems? And we go through a whole process of trying to identify which are the top needs that they want addressed. And I mean, it's almost cruel to ask which of these 100 needs do you want to actually focus on, but we can't promise everything, and we don't. And so anyways, they go through this process, they choose their main needs that they want addressed. And then we go out on tender to find service providers that can meet those needs. We never prescribe beforehand that it's going to be solar panels, or it's going to be solar powered streetlights, or it's going to be microgrid. We just say that we need service providers that can solve X, Y, and Z need of this community. What are you offering? And in this case, we try to ensure that it's service providers that have experience in this space. So they're not running pilots on these communities and using them as test cases. They also need to have a sustainable business model in place. So these aren't supposed to be handouts either. So they need to have some kind of model in place where the community can continue to pay for them, or have businesses in the area contribute towards it. Just as an example, the solar-powered Wi-Fi enabled streetlights are paid for by neighboring businesses who actually advertise on the login platform. So people join, they see a 30-second advert, and then they get 30 minutes of free Wi-Fi. And that's quite a cool way to finance these kind of solutions, especially on a private property. On the other side, we have two communities that, based on the needs and what can be offered, we've got solar-powered systems that have the capability to power lights, but also small DC appliances, and these are paid off at 50 Rand per month for over a 2-year period. People in that community, as an example, are paying about 5 Rand for a candle a night. So when you do the maths, it's really just about reutilizing that or reinvesting that money into something with more productive use. So finance has been seen as a barrier, and to a certain extent that's definitely true, but there are definitely also innovative models that have been proven around the world that can be utilized and also contextualized for our uses as well. But one of if I can talk about this, the video what we're here to talk about, not what I'm doing, but what this video is about. I actually really enjoyed it. I was, it's hard to contextualize something like a 10,000 person island with, something like South Africa or even Cape Town, or even, Khayelitsha has 400,000 people. So it's really quite a different thing to imagine, and also an African context versus, even though it's next to Africa, a European context is also very different to engage with. I completely agree with Tanaka with the idea of having a champion, but at the same time, champions also stand sometimes to block processes, especially if they become kind of like gatekeepers in the process. But it's amazing that this person was committed enough to continue through with this process. I love that they considered the technological prowess of the stuff that they put in there. They had those first 2 wind turbines which hadn't been considered before. They weren't contextually situated, and obviously they didn't work. It's a miracle that the community was still open to doing this again. And that's also, I think, resonates with a lot of communities in South Africa that have had, terrible handouts just thrown onto them and expected that they will use them. Like, for example, the solar water heaters that have been dropped on a couple of roofs, and or the ones that aren't on roofs and sitting in storage for the last 5 years because they weren't, they didn't have a good, community mobilization process in the first place. But that they were willing, this community was willing to, have these wind turbines and so on. I think the financial element obviously was picked up as well, and the political will. But I didn't actually see anything about community involvement in that video. There wasn't that much engagement. There was 2 comments on that they were skeptical, but not really how they addressed that skepticism, apart from just a wait and see approach. But curiously enough, I Googled it afterwards, as one does, because you can't really watch a Netflix thing without having your phone in front of you. So, or at least I can't. So Googled Aliero, and apparently they had quite a massive community, engagement process, where they had entire education programs that were run for the schools, because you also can't just switch from grid diesel fossil fueled energy to renewables but not expect a change in consumption behavior. They always say, you try to be efficient first before you change your entire source of energy. And I think this is clearly a case. And I think that information was definitely left out of this. So please just bear that in mind when you think, well, you could definitely do an amazing case like this without actually involving the community. I'll stop there. I talk a lot. Like I'm seeing people like kind of glaze over.
No, not at all, Reshmi. You could have carried on. Thank you. It's amazing what's come out of both your and Tanaka's input is this contextualization and the local factors that I think have to be present and have to be properly addressed for anything like the El Hierro example, which I think we have to look at on the spectrum. It's obviously an isolated example, but an example that can be successful. What struck me in that whole, even the headline of that series is it's Islands of the Future. And I was intrigued at the concept of islands of the future. You know, it sort of, I thought, well, why are we fixing the islands? Aren't we one big island? But I haven't watched all the series, so maybe that's kind of how it goes full circle. And there is this interconnectedness, and so that those lessons are obviously translated as much as we can across the globe. One lives in hope. But thank you so much, Reshmi. That was great to hear it from the local Western Cape perspective, but in the broader context of what we take for granted, which is turning on the tap and getting running water, or flipping a light switch and we have electricity. It's a luxury that we enjoy, I think, without giving it a second thought when we are the minority, certainly. But now, just going to shift the discussion within the context overseas, actually, and we're going to ask Romain, whose surname I tried to pronounce earlier but got it horribly wrong. He is with the university, or it's the Groningen Center of Energy, or the University of Groningen, and Romain's a doctor there and a postdoc fellow, and he's been doing a lot of work in the energy transition legal space in France, and also was involved in his earlier years in actually a development of a wind farm in France. So this has quite a lot of parallels with the El Hierro dynamic in terms of the wind generated power, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it from an EU perspective, particularly because in our environmental space anyway, the EU's norms, standards, regulations and laws are often looked at as some sort of benchmark against which to measure, the development of our jurisprudence. So I'm very interested, just on a personal level, to hear, the background in that space and how it's played out for you particularly. Thanks, and then I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for the introduction. And just to add to this, indeed, to my, I would say, profile, I also spent a couple of years in South Africa, in Potch, actually, in the NWU. So I have a special feeling always towards South Africa, and a bit of ground experience, even though I was just basically going there and sitting at the library to write my thesis at this moment. And currently, so I'm doing my postdoc here in the University of Groningen as a part of an EU project, which basically looks for the transition of different islands in the EU. So that's completely within the topic of tonight, I think. Actually, the 3 islands I'm working on are also, that's what I've seen in the series of the Netflix documentaries. These are Samsø in Denmark, the Orkneys in northern UK, and Madeira in Portugal. So I'm really part of these transitions as well, assessing more the legal framework from EU perspective and the national law perspective in all these islands that don't have exactly the same installation as in El Hierro, because each island is specific. So each island needs to have its own generation mix and its own transition process with different actors and with different technologies, etc., and with different time frames. But some of other islands are also making great progress, especially the ones, for example, in Samsø, which is already over 100% in terms of electricity from renewables. Why? Because they have a cable connecting them to the mainland, which is that basically is a geographical island, but not an energy island, where we also have to separate indeed between these kinds of islands, because when you have a cable to mainland, basically the mainland, you can use it as a battery to actually balance out your own grid. But for the other islands, for example, Madeira, they're only at 30% of renewables. It's also part of the documentaries. I saw it, I think last year. I really wish you can watch it. It's very interesting. And El Hierro, I just looked at the figures for 2019, they produce 54% of their electricity out of renewables just with this plant. After we can come back to the figures in terms of costs as well, because I had a quick look, but maybe for this later on. Now, also what you just said, Patrick, why islands actually? Why this focus on islands? Well, basically because islands are considered as laboratories. They are considered energy transition labs because they reproduce a global system on a smaller scale. So you can really assess how you manage this issue of variability of renewable energy production, and especially of wind and solar at a small scale to avoid the blackout or load shedding. Well, I'm also very used to load shedding. The first day in South Africa, it was load shedding day in 2015. So yeah, I definitely see what it is about. So you want to really test the technologies, and that's why you go to islands, because it's perfect, it's smaller size, so it's a good place to just implement these changes. And actually at EU level, the policy or the goal is to decarbonize 1,000 islands by 2030. That's a hell of a work. I don't know if it will work, because I mean 1,000 islands, that's really something, but this is the goal. And of course, the lessons that we would take from there could be applied to the mainland in France, but also this in France, in the EU, sorry, but you can really easily apply them to any isolated grid, including in South Africa, in Southern Africa as well, to see how you will actually balance out once more your grid. Now I will say a few words about the concept of just transition and how it is implemented in EU law, because that's at the same time an old and a rather new concept. And it's in many discourses now by some political authorities sometimes to talk about the just transition. And I think that's a very good thing, but we need to know what we're talking about. So the concept of just transition in the 80s, it arose from labor unions in North America. So in Canada and in the US, that were just reacting to the new laws in terms of clean air and clean water that could actually threaten some of the jobs. So they said that it's okay, but it is not up to the workers to pay for these changes that are actually good for everyone. So this is where they actually pushed for the state to implement some funds to do reskilling, upskilling for the local workers and their communities. This is the idea. Now, in the 2010s, they have broadened the scope to actually apply it to climate change and all the transition we are going through. And in this case, they have been quite successful actually to reach a high level, because unions and NGOs actually managed to push it to the International Labour Organization, which issued in 2015 the guidelines on the for a just transition with a broad actually scope, which also included gender approaches, for example, and a holistic approach. So it's not only really specifically about workers, it's mainly about workers, but already starting to take into account some other issues as well of the transition. And then it was also mentioned in the outcome of Rio +20 in 2012 of the conference. It was also mentioned in the preamble of the Paris Agreement in 2015 for a just transition. And in the 2018 Solidarity and Just Transition Silesia Declaration, which was adopted at the end of 2018 in Poland at the end of the COP 24. So this is really a concept that has really reached another level, another scale in comparison to what it was in the 80s, in the early 90s. It has broadened in terms of its focus, and it has broadened in terms of its geographical implementation and impact. Now, recently, around 2017, we have some energy and environmental scholars that sought to actually really broaden it even more. There is a very interesting paper about that from 2017 from Healy and Barry. I can put after, if you want the title in the chat for you to find it, where basically they say when you change the energy system, you change the whole society. Because basically energy is the blood of society. So you want to have a just transition that is not only focusing on workers and their close communities, especially for these highly impacted areas, but you want actually to have a transition that is just for everyone. And when in the end, when you have transited to a new system based on renewables or decarbonized energies, then that it is a fairer system than the ones that you were in at the beginning. They refer at some point where they just say that overcoming carbon lock-in cannot be as a price of an energy justice lock-in. So this is really where we need to take into account all these elements of energy justice. Just transition is very close to energy justice, but just transition is also very close to energy democracy, which is another concept for the transition, and which is very much focused on local ownership of the energy generation installations and public participation, all these kind of really elements for basically a better democracy, not only just having here one wind farm which is owned by a multinational company, which are two very different levels of development of the energy transition. Yeah, and so in terms of the implementation in the law, well, in the EU, it has started to pop out a bit everywhere over the past years, really this term. Sometimes it was not directly the term, it was socially fair transition, but increasingly more we have the term of just transition, and especially at the end of last year, the new commission presented the just transition mechanism with the just transition fund. Basically, this is about creating legally a new fund for the transition, and where it would specifically focus part of the money on the regions that would be the most impacted by the transition. So basically the coal mining regions, the heavy industries regions. If we take, of course, the case of South Africa, it would be Mpumalanga and Limpopo, I would assume, in order to help these local communities directly with this money for reskilling, upskilling, but also for developing some local infrastructures also to help them not being impacted so strongly by this transition. So basically, now we are a bit in between these two concepts, between the rather narrow one based on workers and communities. This is really where we have most of the impact and most of the money and most of the legal tools that are being implemented. But in the discourse and even in some parts of these funds, etc., there are some elements that are integrated about inequalities or about fairness, about gender, about all these issues. But usually, the more you go broader in terms of the scope, the less it becomes legal. So it's okay in terms of symbols, but in terms of the reality, it's a bit more complicated, I would say. I think I will stop here. It's already 10 minutes, and we can continue after.
Man, thank you. That's an immense amount of information that you've given us from a broad scope of areas. I'm fascinated to hear about the concept of the just transition as a broadening concept, and how the initial narrow focus has changed, and the prospects or the ideas around creating funds and mechanisms that address what the just transition means for particular industries or particular jobs and the like. Because South Africa has, as you will know, having spent some time here, a particular set of issues around that, and being a very heavily reliant on coal in terms of our power, there's an enormous opportunity there for us to have what would be, I would hope, a meaningful transition through that process. But if it's not managed correctly, it could have dire consequences for a large number of people. But thank you so much. We are a little tight for time. We're going to move quickly across from further north to further south with Professor Murombo, who's very kindly joined us. He needs very little introduction. He's a professor of law at Wits University, a director of the Mandela Law Institute, a member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, also a member of the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, so our counterpart across Bight Bridge. And it's just an absolute pleasure to have you with us, Professor. Please, the floor is yours. We look forward to your input.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you everyone who has managed to be online this time of the day after possibly long days of being online. I didn't manage to watch the documentary, so what I did was to just really watch the trailer and hope that those who have watched it and the speakers before me will give me a sufficient backdrop to be able to give some input. Obviously, we don't have enough time to discuss everything that we would love to discuss in terms of discussing energy transitions, what a just transition would be, and the sustainable energy, not only in South Africa, but particularly on the African continent. So I'm just going to make a few points in about 5 minutes or so. I think it was Reshmi who pointed out that what was happening in the documentary should just not blindside us, the fact that it was a small island. You can't relate the population size of the island to South Africa, to a whole country, but it was a laboratory in terms of being able to assess what can work and how could it work, how would it work if you are going to be implementing it in a large scale. The same thing happens with, any technology, any transition. You want to first experiment and see what are the potential challenges with the new technology that you are introducing. So I think the documentary provides a good example and good lessons for how could a country like South Africa or countries that want to transition go about these great transitions. But I want to emphasize that there's a very big difference between a change and transition. And what I've seen from a lot of scholarship is an emphasis on pressing too much ahead, too much fast with this transition. Of course, climate change and the adverse environmental consequences of the current ways of producing and consuming energy are dire and are urgent. But they are not urgent in terms of time and scale, the same way that we have a medical emergency. This is a planetary emergency. And we should be able to understand in terms of conceptualizing the time it would take for this transition to happen in a manner in which it will not leave some behind and promote new elites and promote a new lock-in, as it were. So there have been many energy transitions in the history of energy. From your steam engines, from wood, from the primitive communalism, to the use of wood, the use of stones, the use of water, the discovery of the ICE, the internal combustion engine, and now we're discovering electric engines. These transitions were long. So I think people are misleading themselves in believing that the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy can be done quickly, even within a century. I beg to differ, particularly when you look at how entrenched an energy system is. So dislodging a whole energy system, like the fossil fuel energy system, will take some time. And we need to be very careful in terms of what are we creating in place of the entrenched, the established energy system that we are hoping to dislodge. Oftentimes, we can create new problems, and we won't even realize it now. You only realize it once you have decommissioned all your coal-fired power stations. You've moved away from coal. You are now fully on renewables. Then you realize the magnitude of the challenge that we have in terms of even achieving energy justice or access to energy. So in terms of energy security, we must not lose sight of the fact that energy security is not just really about environmental security. It's about access. It's about affordability. It's about reliability. If you're having load shedding now, even with the very few renewable energy projects that have come online, even if, let's take for granted that the Department of Energy was going to liberalize the renewable energy industry and allow all IPPs to come online and allow metros and municipalities to procure energy anyhow they want from anyone who's producing it. Do we think that in a space of 40, 50 years, those suppliers will be able to replace the stability or the supply of energy that we are getting currently from ESCO or from fossil fuels? That's the question I want to pose to you. Do you think that I'm saying 20 to 30 years, 2040, for example, if ESCOM was going to be decommissioning everything by 2040, and if we remove all the legal bottlenecks in terms of entry into the energy market by IPPs, do you think that by 2040, South Africa will be energy secure in the three senses of affordability, reliability, and accessibility? And accessibility, we're talking of dealing with energy poverty. How many of our populations do not have access to energy? And what is the best way? What is the most cost-effective and sustainable way of providing energy to those who are right now confronted with the problem of energy poverty? And even before 2020, before COVID, now we have COVID. So look at the pandemic and how much it's going to take for us to recover from the pandemic. How much is it going to take for us to recover to the extent that whoever is providing and producing energy services is able to have a margin of operation and recover the cost of producing energy. Because currently ESCOM is actually run by us through our tax money. It is not sustainable. If it were to insist on everyone paying for electricity, and if it were to insist on charging the actual cost of producing electricity, we would be looking at a different situation altogether. Of course, I am aware of the levelized costs. Renewables are becoming cheaper and more or less the same as fossil fuels. But a lot of detail go into these issues that we tend to overlook, and we look at the bigger issues, the big picture, and suddenly it becomes viable to transition to low carbon energy. But I think it's important to take into account the fundamentals of an industry, the fundamentals of an energy system. It is a whole system. I was reading with interest, the minister just published the list of strategic infrastructure development projects. And they are planning to turn the whole of the Mpumalanga Highveld into a renewable energy development zone, for example. And then I was wondering how many of these renewable energy projects are going to absorb the current labor and jobs that are into fossil fuels, from the mines to the transporters, to everyone who is in the value chain of producing electricity. And I'm just using the example of electricity, but there are other issues in terms of a just transition, not just electricity. We're also talking of petroleum. We're also talking of the role of gas in the transitional phase. And so you find that there are extremes in between. There are those who argue that we can transition quickly, and they even discount gas. We just must go to renewables. And there are those who argue that, we can't just move leapfrog to renewables as it were. We could possibly use natural gas and gas as a bridge to a low carbon economy, to renewable energy, which I believe is more sensible and more realistic when you look at the social, economic, and the political context of South Africa and many countries in Africa. So I think the laws that we are we have to design to enable this transition, these laws must be grounded in the social economic realities. Of course, they must be informed by international developments. They must be informed by the international, pressures, climate change pressures. But even when you look globally, how many countries have now moved, even say 50% to renewables? I know a lot of countries in the EU have done a lot, but look at the biggest emitters, the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Where are they in terms of their transition? Where is Russia? Where is China? Where is the USA in terms of their transition to a low carbon energy economy or low carbon energy system? And if we don't deal with those big emitters, yes, of course, what we do, the other small countries will matter. But in terms of the big picture of the 2 degrees of 1.5 degrees that we have to maintain, I think we need to get the biggest emitters on board. And there is a reason why they're not on board. It's not just really Trumpism. I mean, Russia has nothing to do with Trump. China, India, all of them, there are issues, there are fundamental economic issues that are putting brakes on the speed with which we can transition to a low carbon energy economy or energy system. And one of the biggest issues is really the fear of the change, the fear of the transition. And by fear, I'm making reference to energy insecurity. So a lot of the current regimes, they are comfortable in the present. This is what we know. This is how we know to produce energy. Even our economies, they are built around the energy systems that we have developed. So to transition is going to take some time. We're asking them to change. I often pose a question to the iron and steel industry, for example, because they always argue that they need a base load. You can't run an aluminum smelter with renewable energy because you can't shut it down. Then there's a lot of arguments. You can actually, if you have sufficient storage to store your wind energy or your solar energy, then it can be calibrated so that it can supply the same amount of constant current or constant power to a smelter. But what does it take for us to have an electrical system which can actually fire smelters, for example, which can actually fire some of the manufacturing and industrial processes that require baseload power? So I'm not saying it's impossible. It is possible, but have we considered what that possibility means in terms of cost, in terms of the justness, as it were, of the transition? And going back to the issue of the just transitions, energy justice, I mean, from my first year in law school, one of the least defined concepts in law is justice. And I often wonder why people love it, but we love it because it is easier to use, because there's no consensus on it. So it's easier to use without necessarily getting down into the nitty-gritties, the details of what exactly do you mean by a just transition. The Minister of Energy is talking of a just transition. The IRP talks of a just transition. ESCOM is talking of a just transition. NGOs, CSOs, they're talking of a just transition. Do they mean the same thing? If we were to ask them to say, can you lay down what is the program for a just transition? You know, if you talk to the labor unions and to the corporates on their understanding of a just transition, you'll find that in practice, implementing this, even making a law which enshrines principles of just transition, it's going to be very, very complicated because there are interests involved. Some are entrenched, some are new interests. So what I want to say is that I think at this stage, a transition to a low carbon economy is possible. A transition from a fossil fuels industry, energy system is possible. But I think there's need for moderation in terms of how we're advocating for this transition. There's a risk of leaving some behind, particularly when we're talking in Africa, where there's a lot of energy poverty. We are talking of things that are, in my view here, could be considered elitist. Solar. I mean, how many people in Alexandra, in Soweto, in Limpopo, in the rural areas can afford to power their whole house on solar? What is the cost of solar? Go and Google right now to say, okay, a 2-roomed house with a stove, with a TV, with a fridge, and 4 lights. If you want to install a solar system for that house, just go and find out how much does it cost. You are looking upwards of 80,000 rands for a functional, stable, reliable system to supply energy. And I've looked at this and I was saying, you know what, how many people can afford this actually? So if people can't afford it, it means the government would have to come in with a lot of incentives, which is all right, and it is necessary because the fossil fuel industry has been sucking money out of the government for centuries. So I think it is fair to also expect the government to put in a lot of money into renewable energy, into supporting the budding renewable energy industry, whether it's in terms of preferential treatment, whether in terms of procurement, in terms of tariffs, or in terms of any other incentives. I think that is important. But the challenge that we have also is when you go to really think about energy systems and how they've developed and looking at energy as a public service, there's a fear on the part of government that the transition is accompanied by increased space for the private sector. And the private sector has never been associated with the public interest. And that is a big challenge in terms of particularly the energy transition. We are looking at the private sector to drive the energy transition, but the private sector has rarely been associated with the public interest or with providing a public service. And I think that's where the biggest fear of the government is in terms of letting go of, for example, of ESCOM and allowing in more IPPs. It's not just really a matter of transforming the energy system or the energy markets. Once the government allows that to happen, a lot is at stake. Access to electricity, access to energy, dealing with energy poverty at a government public level becomes quite a challenge when you are dealing with suppliers and producers who are largely private players. Because the private sector is not after anything but interest and profit. And that's very important. We must not forget that. However, they pretend to be philanthropic. IPPs are there, they're in business. They are investing in business. They expect a return on their investment. And a return on an investment means a profit. A loss does not make sense. But ESCOM can shoulder losses at the expense of trying to expand access to energy, access to energy services, and deal with energy poverty. So there's this whole issue of the public sector, the provision of public services, and the role of the private sector, and the future of the energy industry or our energy systems. If they're anchored on private sector players, there's a big challenge there in terms of transforming the focus, transforming the agenda of the private sector players. And that's why there's a lot of opposition from labor. Because labor can easily bargain with the public sector, with the government. But once you privatize, as it were, the energy sector, it becomes difficult for labor to actually bargain with the private sector without, of course, destroying or burning down the installations in the infrastructure, which doesn't really make sense at all. So I think there are issues there in terms of balancing the private sector objectives and the public sector objectives, and the role of energy law in enabling this transition in a manner that really does not leave anyone behind. My greatest concern is leaving those who least afford energy services behind by going on to something that for now might look comparable to energy coming from fossil fuels, but in fact, when you allow it to run on its own, becomes more and more expensive. Obviously, economies of scale will come into play decades into a renewable energy-driven energy market or energy system, because then you have more players, the price will be driven down. But again, how many South African companies are involved in this renewable energy industry? Who is claiming the space? Who is claiming the knowledge, the IP, the intellectual property rights to the technology that we are using? In 30, 40 years, will we be able to domesticate or to at least have some transfer of that technology that we can commercialize it at affordable rates on the African continent? These are all big questions that I don't have answers to, but I think that obviously law has got a role to play in the transition, the energy transition, but that role is dependent a lot on technology and how technology evolves to align with the socio-economic context of any particular country or geographic space where you want to implement new technologies. And I think we have a big challenge here. Climate change is a reality. We need to tackle it, but at the same time, we have to live. We've locked ourselves into a mode of production where we can't just easily get out. We are in a capitalist mode of production. We can't easily get out of that unless we change that.
Could I jump in there? We're running out of time. In fact, we've run out of time, technically speaking. But just if you've got any last thoughts, just to wrap up there before we just go to all of the other speakers for their last little inputs, and then if there are any pressing questions, we'll just address those. Prof, if you just want to wrap up, if I can be so bold as to ask.
Thanks, Patrick. With me, you have to be bold. Otherwise, I will speak until all the time. So boldness is a good attribute. So thank you for showing boldness. I think I was almost done. My main point is this: whatever we are arguing for, I think we need to think a little bit more about the socio-economic context and the potential unintended consequences of a rushed transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Appreciate it. I think El Hierro perhaps showed us a window down the rabbit hole, and we've been firmly placed in reality of what it actually means for us to even think about changing from a fossil fuel entrenched system into something different. I did see one of the comments there that this recent pandemic has, however, shown the capacity for people to change their behaviors literally overnight. So perhaps we can only hope for something similar. But just to go back in closing, Tanaka, if I can just put the ball back in your court for any sort of parting shots or words of wisdom, having listened to all the other speakers from your side.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yeah, so like as Dr. I've forgotten your title, Tumai Murombo, like the way you were speaking, I had so many things that I wanted to jump in and say, but I think the biggest thing which I've taken from what you've said, and possibly from the whole speech from tonight, from this whole event, is that I think a transition is possible, but we can't go into it blindly. We need to be aware of the challenges that are present so that we can try and alleviate those challenges. So it won't be as quick as things happen maybe in El Hierro, and it might take us a long time, but we at least need to take a stand and make that first step, and eventually we will get there. But as long as we know which direction we want to head in. Yeah, so that's it from me tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanaka. Reshmi, if I can ask the same of you, just in closing, your pearls of wisdom.
Pearls of wisdom. Well, thank you as well for having me here. Yeah, there was a lot of information in the last speaker's presentation. So as Tanaka said as well, it was at every point it was, oh, I have a good point for that, I have a good point for that, and then it just kind of carried on, and I forgot what the first point was. So there's a lot of information to take in and process. I'll get back to you tomorrow. But just as a concluding comment as well, that I agree completely that a transition is possible. We've seen it the world over. I mean, just you mentioned about the biggest emitters, you know, China and USA and Russia, for example. China is actually the biggest investor in renewable energy in the whole entire world, as much as it is as an emitter. So, I mean, if China can do it, you know, we're not doing nearly as much. We have ways to do this. I also completely agree that it can't just be a public initiative. It can't just be a private one. It has to be a public-private partnership. And at the same time, we need to include the people that are affected by these decisions that are made from all these angles. So that's probably my, I mean, I'm biased towards that opinion, but this just transition, it cannot be just if we don't include the people that are affected by it. So yeah, just a final thought on that.
Thanks, Reshmi, appreciate it. Time is running away. So Romain, if I can ask you just to jump in and give us.
Yes, yeah, so just a couple of elements in terms of cost. For me, the energy transition is really actually not a headache anymore. I mean, you see the prices are absolutely crazy for big installations. For example, for solar, I think yesterday it's for 12 euros per megawatt hours. The contract, it's nothing. It's way less than pushing from coal in all of the world. So actually, there is no problem in terms of the cost, at least in the big installations. And it is scheduled that in all over the world, solar plus storage will be less expensive than existing generation plants. 2025, solar plus storage. So you don't have this issue of intermittency anymore with these two elements. So in terms of purely technicalities, if you have this plus you implement strong limitations in terms of energy consumptions and energy consumption reduction for developed countries, never is the same for Africa, you can definitely reach actually a transition by 2050. I think that technically and economically, this is not a problem. And you even have some places such as, I mean, even Texas in the state in the US with the most wind energy installed in the country. I mean, Texas is the land of oil. Just it's so cheap there that they have just bought it. So there is really not this issue of costs and techniques. That's really much more about the main questions are how, as we said, with this issue of justice, and with whom, with which kind of factors. And this is where indeed, and to close with this and to come back to what Prof Murombo said, well, to always keep the idea that law is a very important instrument for that, to implement this issue of justice, and that justice has to be the base of the law. So this is really not an issue of technicalities or economics. In my opinion, and based on all the reports I'm seeing, this is really on how you organize this transition and how if you let enough time and enough possibility for local communities to be actually instrumental in these developments in order to avoid imposing something that seems nice, but that's still imposed anyway. Thank you.
Thanks, Romain, appreciate it. Well, I know our speakers have certainly done all of their respective roles and given us an enormous amount of food for thought. I hope I've managed to steer it at least in a way that's provided some productive output and that we've all managed to learn something. There have been some really interesting comments in the side, and I've seen a few ends of the spectrum being aired, which is great. South Africa is going to have its own unique challenges going forward, but I certainly think there's a lot to be learnt. We don't need to walk into this blindly, as has already been said. And hopefully at the end of the day, we do manage to forge the middle way where, at the risk of burning either side of the spectrum, we find some sort of via media that gets us to where we need to be and provides lights and energy security for the people who live here. Just a big thank you to Advocate Peter Cantor, who's been very quiet, although there have been a few comments on the side. He's our fearless chairman and leading the Environmental Law Association through these rather turbid times. So we thank you, Peter. Again, to Melanie and Catherine, who've soldiered through this and made this virtual platform a reality. And again, to our speakers, we are immensely grateful for the time. It is 8:30 on a weeknight. So thank you very much for giving of your energy. I know there would have been a bit of time put in before tonight, and we all sincerely hope that you enjoyed the documentary. There will be more streaming sessions, so I have to do the little ad pitch, please. We would love to have you with us.